Hello, it is Thursday today for a Facebook Live, and that is because I am totally booked on Friday tomorrow with some really fun things, actually. So we're coming at you on a Thursday for our neuro topic of the week, and this week it is ataxia. And again, why are we doing these? One is that I'm just a total neuro nerd and love talking about this stuff. That's one reason, but really is because we do so much learning in reactive. So if you didn't know, I'm from Reactive Physical Therapy and Wellness, which is a neurologic physical therapy practice in the LA area. And we really focus our therapy on neurologic disorders and changing the brain. And we do a lot of learning in our fellowship program here, and we really want to just share that with the world. And what is coming up very soon is our last learning module of the year, which is on ataxia. And ataxia is so interesting to me, especially because it involves the cerebellum, my second favorite part of the brain after the brainstem. But in an ataxia, it can be very challenging to treat and to make progress. And so, that actually is one of the main characteristics of a lot of the disorders that we talk about, because we want to help understand them a little better and to be able to drive progress and help people find some really lasting gains. So let's dive right into it. So today we're going to talk about what is ataxia, including that like sensory ataxia versus cerebellar ataxia. We're going to talk about the cerebellum and motor learning, and two of my favorite topics, and then how understanding some of that underlying piece might help drive treatment. Now we're going to talk a lot more about treatment next week, so we're going to do a two-part series here, but we're going to dive into some of the underlying pieces as well. So let's talk about just the word ataxia, and this actually can be very confusing. We talk about this in our course that I teach at USC in our neuropathology course. It can be a very confusing term. There are a lot of things that fall under it. So ataxia by definition means a lack of order. And we might see this in the nervous system for two main causes. We're going to talk about cerebellum, but I want to just briefly touch on sensory ataxia. So imagine, and maybe you don't have to imagine this because it's happened to you, where you have lost sensation. So this might happen to you when you've slept on an arm or a leg funny or something like that. You can't feel your limb. And so then when you go to move it, you have very little control over it because you're not getting that sensory feedback about where it is. And that may look very ataxic or uncoordinated, and that's called sensory ataxia. Now, cerebellar ataxia it can look similar, but the underlying mechanism is much different because it's not about the sensation. So what we actually see in ataxia are disordered contractions of the agonist muscle and the antagonist muscle, or opposite sides of the limb muscles, and a lack of normal coordination between these movements at different joints. And it includes several different things, and I think this is where it can get confusing. It includes things like dysrhythmia, so having abnormal timing. It can include dysmetria, which is the actual trajectory, abnormal trajectory. You might hear a term like appendicular, which is ataxia in the hemispheres, or from cerebellar hemispheric involvement, but it's in the extremities, so in the arms and the legs. It might be truncal ataxia, which includes a very wide base of support. And that is a little more likely from cerebellar vermis involvement, and these are the different parts of the cerebellum. You might hear a term like intention tremor, and this is really not really a tremor, but it's when somebody is going to touch an object, so they might do the finger to nose test, and they have dysmetria at that very end of the movement. So that's called an intention tremor. You may hear this, one of my favorite words, dysdiadochokinesia, and this is when we do a test that's rapid alternating movements. So pronation and supination, and dysdiadochokinesia is the term for that. And then you may also see something called loss of check. And a loss of check is something that we might see when we do a manual muscle test and we're resisting. And typically if I resist it, that the arm can hold still. A loss of check means that they can't check that movement. When we teach this in class, we often have to play a little ice cube to go with the loss of check. So those things are all under the umbrella of ataxia. So dysrhythmia, dysmetria, it could be appendicular or truncal, dysdiadochokinesia, loss of check. They all can be a part of the ataxia. And the why comes down to our cerebellum. So I had to share a couple of things. So first of all, how cute is this? This is my daughter's brain, Brayna. And Brayna is mostly brain, you can see, mostly cortex, but down here is the cerebellum. And what is so cool about the cerebellum, it actually has been called the little brain, is that it's very small compared to the rest of the brain, right? But it actually contains way more neurons than the whole rest of the cortex. So it's very compact. And I find it really quite beautiful. If you've ever had a chance to see one dissected, it's gorgeous. It really is. And you might think I'm just a crazy neuro nerd, but it really is. It has this intricate structure and foldings so that you can have all of those neurons fit in a small place. And it has some distinct parts and lobes, and I'm not going to go through a whole neuroanatomy lesson, though I would love that. But one of the most interesting, for example, is the floccular nodular lobe. I mean, who wouldn't love that name? But the floccular nodular lobe in the cerebellum has very important connections to the vestibular system, for example. So we had talked about the hemispheres of the cerebellum being having a very specific role. The floccular nodular lobe has a very specific role. The vermis has a very specific role. And depending then where there's a lesion in the cerebellum, you might have different functions affected. So it might be more distal coordination, it might be more the trunk, it might be more motor planning. And then in treatment, we would be able to then capitalize on the neuroplasticity in the cerebellum. So the changes that can take place within those neurons and the connections. And we can try to influence or use other aspects of the cerebellum that are intact. And I think that's really important. I think it's very important to understand the underlying mechanism where the lesion is. Is it in the hemispheres? Is it in some of the central structures, in the deep nuclei? And that is going to help drive the treatment and understand which parts of the treatment might be most effective. So that is the first piece. Ataxia, where it's coming from and why those different parts of the cerebellum are important. Now, let's talk about the role of the cerebellum in motor learning, because this is why it can be so challenging in rehab. So one of my favorite lectures from neuroanatomy at USC, for which I've been helping out in the clinical lab part of that with Dr. Bradley, is the cerebellum. And it's one of my favorite lectures for many reasons. One, it has this really cool lab components with some really neat slices of the cerebellum. But she talks about the cerebellum as the comparator I think I'm saying that right. But basically it's comparing things and it's detecting errors, and error detection is so important for our learning. And in fact, this takes us all the way back to schema theory, which is Dick Schmidt's motor learning theory that has influenced our practice. Is the why behind why we have the Schmidt Movement Disorder Fellowship. But error detection is very important. And in the most simplest form, so I'm going to totally simplify this, the cerebellum takes the what I intended to do piece of things and compares it to what I actually did, and it makes changes. And it makes changes very quickly. One researcher, Amy Bastian, if you're a physical therapist, you have probably heard her speak or seen her work. She's somebody I admire a lot. She has done a lot of work in this area, especially in looking at error-based learning and the cerebellum. So that's the third part that I want to talk about is, since we kind of understand ataxia, understand the cerebellar role, the different parts of the cerebellum, understand its role in motor learning, then we want to know, well, what does that mean for us, for how we might set up therapy, how we might understand what's going on. And Amy Bastian's work I think has been really instructional in this field. So some of the things that I've learned from her work, from some really great articles that she's published, from seeing her speak as well, is that this comparator role of the cerebellum is very important. It has and develops this internal model of the body that can be used to make predictions about movement. And this is why it can happen very quickly. And, what is seen in the studies with people who have cerebellar lesions is that that damage actually impairs some of that error-driven motor learning process that we would see through adaptation. So that is definitely impaired with a cerebellar lesion. And what Amy Bastian has shown, though, is that with changing the way we might set up that learning or do that learning, we can improve the adaptation ability. So I think that's very important. We see that damage impairs error-driven motor learning, but that with some specific ways of training that can be improved. So for example, they had a really nice motor learning study that looked at reaching movement. So these are very common in motor learning studies. And they found that if a person with a cerebellar disorder was perturbed during the reaching movement, not abruptly in one step, but slowly and gradually over many movements, they could adapt. And I think of that, and I think we can see that in people when they're moving with ataxia, that they may then respond a little better to gradual changes in, let's say, the load, in the demand, in the environment, et cetera. But the adaptation does occur. So I think that's a really good point, and it points to neuroplasticity, that adaptation can occur even with these, with some deficits in the error-driven motor learning processes. So that was one particular study. In another study, they found, they were comparing, now forgive me because I'm not a motor learning researcher, but I did kind of dive into these articles looking for some specific take-home points for us. So I'm not going to go crazy detail into some of the motor learning theory behind this, but when they looked at ways to help train movement, they found that for people with a cerebellar disorder, they were able to learn, especially with reinforcement versus just error-based learning. So what is this reinforcement learning? So the reinforcement relies on something simple, such as like you succeeded, or or you failed at it. And what's nice about this is that this is kind of like what happens in everyday life. There's not necessarily feedback about the errors how you did it, but that you achieved the item. I think about this a lot because I have a new puppy, and it's like, he's not figuring out how to get his food. It's just like reward, reward, reward. He's getting his food, right? So he's getting reinforced learning because he's getting that success. Ding, I got my food. So that reinforced learning led to a learned reaching pattern in this particular study, better than error-based learning. So I think that is, that's really kind of neat, and something that then we can take into our treatment is thinking about providing that reinforced learning as part of our treatment when we're relearning some motor skills. So those are just two examples, and actually if you look up Amy Bastian's work, there is so much out there. And a lot of this, remember, started with some of her studies of the split-built treadmill, seeing that people with cerebellar disorders did not learn from the error-based learning. So that's where this all started, and I find that very, very fascinating. So let's review and have some take-home points here. So first, I think it's so important to understand where the lesion is that's causing the ataxia. And you know what? Remember that it might not be cerebellar. It might be sensory, right? So understanding the lesion. Second, that the cerebellum, so if it's cerebellar, the cerebellar is so important for motor learning. And motor learning can actually take place despite some serious impairments. And we want to think about oh gosh, a couple of things that I forgot in one of the studies is one of the things that got in the way of some of the motor learning is the noise level. The motor noise is really high. So if we think about the motor noise impairing our ability to have motor learning, how can we reduce the motor noise and use some reinforced learning mechanisms to help a patient meet their goal? And this will be very patient specific. I think the other thing that is really important, knowing that the motor learning is impaired, it might take more time and repetition. And we'll talk about this next week because that shows up in some of the intervention trials. And then finally, this is going to be really fun for next week. This sets us up for which tools we can use to help us with feedback, to help us with the motor learning process that's impaired in ataxia. We know the reinforced learning would be a piece of that, and this directly relates to our treatment and how we can have more success in our interventions for people with ataxia. So you'll have to join us next week as we talk a little bit about specific interventions that have been used, what's been successful, and then certainly if you have been working with people with ataxia and have felt maybe frustrated by lack of progress, or like not really like, should I weight the limb? Should I not? What is this like weighted vest? What do I do here? That is exactly why we are having our mini course in a couple of weeks. It's on November 7th. It's on ataxia. It's a hot topic in our clinic for sure. It comes up a lot in the movement disorder neurology clinics as well. And I think this is going to be a great course. Chelsea Richardson and Lauren Colgin have put it together with some really excellent cases to take us through applying some of these principles, especially where we lack huge randomized controlled trials in these disorders, because then the mechanisms can be so different, right? So our mini course is on November 7th. We'd love to have you join us. You can join us in person at our Re+active clinics, either Re+active Torrance or Re+active West LA. We do a fun potluck, and it's really interactive and engaging in that way. And but you can join us online as well. So we do it webinar style. It is limited in the number of people so that we can have some really nice interaction. So I believe we have about 10 more spots left. If you are interested, grab that. You can also find that at our Re+active education page. So that's reactivept.com/education. You'll see a link to our Ataxia course there. And we're super excited about what is coming up next in Re+active education, and that is a really more intensive experience of learning. And if this is something that you're interested in, please send me an email, because we're going to try a really small beta test, maybe 4 people in this at the beginning of the year. And if you're interested in that, I'd love to have you in there. You can join our email list, or just shoot me an email directly and let us know that you're interested in our mentoring community, and we will reach out to you when we've launched that. But we're putting together a lot of pieces that people have been interested in, with more intensive mentoring with other neuro PTs as they grow their clinical skills. So above and beyond our mini courses. So I would love to hear from you if that's something that you're interested in. And thanks for joining us today for Ataxia. We will catch you next week.